Thank you all for coming for the New York State Climate Act, otherwise known as the Climate Leadership and Community Protection. And just got this little thing here to read. In July of 2019, Governor Cuomo passed the CLCPA and appointed a 32-member committee to draft a statewide plan to meet the targets required by the CLCPA. That plan, called the Climate Action Council, or CAC, scoping plan was finalized and approved in December of 2022. There's a bunch of things in here to read, but because we're starting late and I want to give us all the time we have with the speakers, I'm sure we're going to fill in a lot of this information. Let me just start by introducing our first speaker, which is Dr. Hanley. Here it is. Dr. Hanley is a fellow at the Empire Center for Public Policy and leads the center work on energy and environmental issues, including closely monitored how the state proposes to implement the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, making sure that the true costs are known and the suggestions alternative way to achieve some of those goals. Dr. Hanley has a PhD in political science from the University of Oregon and has an associate professor of the political science at Adrian College before joining the Empire Center. Please welcome Dr. Hanley.
All right, is this turn right so that you can hear me well? Could be louder. All right. Let me lift it up a bit. Maybe. Turn the right one. How's that? All right, good. So when you get back there, Dean, could you turn to the first slide, please? Or the next slide, I should say. This is the first one. So I've been following the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act closely, and I wish I could be more supportive of it. The goals are well intended, but I think the act itself is fairly poorly designed. And if you look at the far right of the slide, this is the main goal. The strategic goal of the Climate Act is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in New York economy-wide by 85% by 2050. And those other goals to the left are kind of the tactical goals on the way towards there. And the two that I want to focus on are the 70% reduction, I'm sorry, the 70% renewable energy production by 2030, and the 100% emissions-free electricity by 2040. The reality is we're not going to hit either of those goals. They were created because they sound good politically. They sound far enough out to achieve for people who aren't looking at the technical details of this. But everybody who works in the industry that I've spoken to just kind of shakes their head. On the renewables, if absolutely everything that's proposed in the pipeline goes through on time, we could hit it. But the reality is a lot of the projects that get into the pipeline, it takes them years to get approved. And even after they're approved, or sometimes in the middle of the process, they'll get pulled because the companies keep reassessing the costs and benefits and realize it's not going to pay off. So not everything in that pipeline is going to get approved. So we're going to miss the 2030 goal of 70% renewables. The goal of 100% emissions-free electricity by 2040 is not going to happen because we simply don't have the prospects of producing enough electricity without still relying on fossil fuels within the next 17 years, which is essentially how long we have to do it. We may get there eventually. I don't like to bet against technology in the long run, but I often bet against the time frame that the optimists believe in. Next slide, please. All right, so on the CLCPA, we've been told over and over that the costs and benefits, that the benefits outweigh the costs. They had a consulting group do this for them. And my first job at the Empire Center was to analyze that cost-benefit analysis. And with my 20 years of background in political economy and public policy, I looked at this and I was appalled. It's make-believe. They throw in a bunch of benefits that don't really have anything to do with climate change or even electrification. And the costs, they don't break down the costs so that you can actually track what different things are going to cost. And it was done before they had any policies in place. So the cost-benefit analysis is not based on the actual policies that have been developed by the Climate Action Council, right? The ones that they propose in the scoping plan that are supposed to become the laws of the state. So what they tell us is New York's going to benefit by $80 to $150 billion. And that would be great if it was true. If you can get that kind of benefit, you should always take it. Next slide. But the reason it's not true is the vast majority of the benefit comes from an assessed value for a ton of carbon, or taking another greenhouse gas, a ton of carbon equivalent. And that's where most of the benefit comes, from the reduction in that carbon. Right, that's fine except for two things. One is New York has a much, much higher estimate of the value of a ton of carbon than anybody else does. If they're using federal government numbers, that would be a lot lower number. Second, when we emit that carbon, it doesn't stay in New York, right? It moves around the atmosphere, neighboring states, even around the world. So this benefit, assuming there's that much benefit, which I have my doubts, but assuming there's that much benefit, it's a global benefit. It's not benefiting just New York. If you take out that amount, a rough back of the envelope estimate, then what we find is, I gotta look at my numbers because I didn't look at this earlier today. The maximum direct benefit to New York is about $170 billion, so we end up with spending $280 to $340 billion to gain $170 billion benefit. That's bad news. Now, there is a response to that, which is a very fair response, which is we shouldn't be imposing costs on the rest of the world and our neighboring states either, so we've admitted this, it's right for us to pay to reduce it. I think that's a fair argument to make politically, but that's not the argument that people have been told in New York. If people were told that and they still wanted to vote for the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, that'd be one thing, right? But when you're sold something on false premises, that's a problem. Next slide. All right, another reason why I don't believe the cost estimate. There's a thing in public policy we call mega projects. These are multi-billion-dollar projects that take years to achieve. When you're talking about a $280 to $340 billion project, we're talking about giga projects, and there's actually, I've counted 9 or 10 individual mega projects within the CLCPA. And the iron law of mega projects is they tend to come in over time, over budget, over and over. They often come in 2, 3, 4, 5 or more times over budget. Is anybody familiar with the East Side Access railroad tunnel that was just completed in New York City? It was over a decade behind schedule. It came in somewhere between 3 and 5 times over budget. Sounds terrible, right? That's normal. That is very much the norm for these big projects. And I could talk for about an hour about why that is, but I won't bore you that much. It's just as a fact. These things almost always come in way over budget. So if we assume that the Climate Act comes in only 50% over that estimated cost, which would be a big win in mega project terms, it still will be a net loss on a global scale. Not just on the New York scale, but on the global scale. Next slide. Next one from that. All right. Now, the cost is one problem, and it's a real problem because it's a cost that's going to be imposed on New Yorkers. If you paid any attention to the recent flap between Governor Hochul and the legislature over the cost of the Cap and Invest program, the way the Climate Act requires them to account for greenhouse gases, it's going to add about $600 per year to the bill for the average natural gas user, and about 62 cents per gallon for gas. Hochul got scared with that because she has to run for re-election in a couple years, right? So she's proposing to change the way we account for that, and that would bring the cost down to about $400 a year for users of natural gas, and only about 30 cents per gallon of gas extra, only, right? These are real costs we're going to have to pay, and the only question is how much we're going to have to pay. Well, the other problem beyond cost is, will we have enough energy? Will we have enough electricity? We're so accustomed to flipping on the lights and the power being there, except maybe during big storms when sometimes things go down, that it's hard for us to believe that we might simply not have enough electricity. But what the New York Independent System Operator, who's responsible for running our grid and analyzing future electricity needs, what they say is we're going to need to increase our electricity production by 2 or 3 times to meet increased demand. And the reason we're going to have so much increased demand is because we're going to electrify all the houses, we're going to electrify all the space heating, and we're going to be charging a lot of electric cars. Because in a few years, you're not going to be allowed to buy a new gas engine car, right? These things aren't necessarily bad in themselves, and you might think so, but that's not the position I want to take. The point is simply that they're going to create a huge demand for more electricity. Next slide. The problem is we're not creating enough new electricity. Our electricity supply is projected to grow much more slowly than the demand. Next slide. Let me just skip past this one because I know I have limited time. I actually kind of got shoved off the stage Tuesday because I talked too long, so I'll try not to do that today. So if we can go to the next one. All right, this is a key slide. We need, by 2030, to add 20 gigawatts more of power. It needs to be renewable power. We haven't really done that in the last 23 years. And in the last 5 years, we've actually, on net, we've added some, we've shut some down. On net over the last 5 years, we've lost 2 gigawatts of electricity production. And that's basically equal to the output of Indian Point. So if we kept Indian Point open, we'd be about even over the last 5 years. But we are currently going downward in electricity production. And over the next 10, 20 years, we're going to be shutting down all of our fossil fuel plants. Our nuclear plants, our remaining nuclear plants, there are 4 nuclear generators. 3 of those will be up for relicensing before 2034. They need to be kept open, but they're getting old. There will be opposition to keeping them running. If they get shut down, then we have an even larger deficit of electricity. Next slide. Let's skip this one too, sorry. Technical details, you don't want to deal with it. All right, so what's going to come to our rescue? Maybe some more hydropower. We're building the Champlain-Hudson Power Express. The biggest area that's going to have problems is New York City. And I was talking recently to the people from the Independent System Operator. They've got a plan. If we start getting blackouts in New York City, to shut off everything around the city, to isolate it, to try to keep that blackout from spreading around the state. But New York's going to be getting the Champlain-Hudson Power Express. That's good, but they planned that before they started talking about shutting down all the natural gas plants in New York City. It was supposed to be in addition to those, not a substitute for them, and it's not guaranteed to be there in the winter. When we get a big winter cold snap like we had before, thank you. Allergies have been getting to me, so I need a drink of water. When we get a big winter cold snap like we had late last year, Quebec is heavily electrified. I think about 80% of their homes are all electric, at least for space heating. They need that electricity. They're going to take care of themselves first, right? Nothing wrong with that. It's just what you'd expect. And maybe there'll be power left over from New York City, but there's no guarantee of it. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, there it is. Wait, I'm sorry. Go back one. All right. This may be a little bit hard to read from where you're at, but this is from the New York Independent System Operator's real-time dashboard of different energy sources at any given time. And this is from, I don't see the date there. I think it was March. And if you see the yellow line that goes straight across, that's a nuclear power. It's always there, doesn't go up or down much, just pretty steady. And you can see that there are kind of 2 peaks. There's a morning peak when everybody gets up, And there's an evening peak when everybody's getting home from school and work. And that's the big peak of the day. Those lines that are going up then, that's natural gas, hydropower, and dual fuel, sometimes burning fuel oil. That line at the bottom, that's wind. It's going down right when we need it that day. That doesn't always. Some days it's rising at that time. I want to be honest here. But it's not reliable. We can't guarantee that the wind is going to be rising when our demand is peaking. And there will be days when, unfortunately, it's falling at that same time that we need it most. Next slide. All right. Solar power to the rescue. I actually heard at a Climate Action Council meeting somebody from Buffalo saying if we'd had more solar power in Buffalo during that big snowstorm last year, we wouldn't have lost power. And I didn't say anything. That person they had their time to speak, and my time to speak was later. But I was just thinking, how is a solar panel going to generate electricity when it's under multiple feet of snow? Right? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. And if you live in New York, what are the winters like? How many of you get up in the dark in the morning in the winter? All right, solar is not going to be generating that morning peak. How many of you go home after dark in the winter? Solar is not going to be generating that evening peak. It generates the most in the middle of the day when demand is actually kind of lower. So in the future, we might be able to use that to generate, to charge up a lot of batteries, but that's decades in the future to have enough batteries. I've seen estimates that to create enough battery power in New York to meet these needs would cost over $1 trillion. All right, the whole Climate Act is supposed to cost no more than $340 billion. So just batteries could more than triple that cost. So we can't rely on solar. Thank you. Next slide. The standard argument in response is you overbuild. You build enough solar, you build enough wind turbines, it's always blowing somewhere, always sunny somewhere. If you're working on a continent-wide scale, there is some logic to that. Although you have to build a huge amount of we'd have to actually triple our transmission capacity in the United States. Over the next 30 years, we'd have to build what it's taken us a century to build so far. So that's not real likely. But if we're looking at a place the size of New York, it's a fairly big state. But we still get weather patterns that are bigger than the whole state. So even in the middle of the day when the sun is shining, you could have cloudy weather over the whole state that's really diminishing your solar power's productivity. You can have a lull over the whole state where you're not getting much wind. And in fact, the Germans who are ahead of New York in this and really struggling have developed a term they call Dunkelflaute, which means a dark lull when you're getting neither enough sun nor enough wind. And the Climate Action Council itself has admitted there's going to be days, weeks, or even longer when we're not getting enough generation from wind and solar combined, so we need to have some other source. Nobody yet knows what that other source is going to be. Next slide. I already mentioned batteries. Batteries are great, they'll be used, but we're a long way away from being able to build enough battery power and have batteries that last long enough. Right now we have 4, maybe 8-hour batteries. The holy grail in battery development is try to get to a 100-hour battery. That's still less than, or about 4 days worth. It's not enough if we're going to need weeks worth of energy production. Next slide. 10%. This is what the independent system operator predicts we're going to be missing. 10% of our needed energy by 2040. We don't have a source for. 10%, that's equal to 2.5 hours a day. That won't be every day, of course, but it could be multiple days at a time. That's a big gap. You don't want to be missing 10% of your need. What you really want is to have surplus energy production, because you never know when a power plant's going to break and go down and you need some more energy from somewhere else, right? So it's probably not well known, but we always try to keep a pretty doggone large surplus in hand, ready to go at any given time. If you're actually running short, somebody's going to be without power and there's just nothing you can do about it. I think this next one is the last slide. Nope. All right, next to last slide, I hope. Here's the worst case scenario. No, there's actually two more. Worst case scenario is we get a big blackout. Go ahead and flip to the next slide. That was the 1970-something blackout, I think, where 50 million people were without power for various periods of time. That was a summer. People died because they didn't have air conditioning. And just recently, just over a year ago in Texas, they had a big freeze. This was not caused by renewable power, I want to emphasize. It was caused by cold weather and Texas utilities not being prepared for cold weather. But it's an example of what happens when the power goes out in winter. Between 240 and 700 people died. They had $200 billion in property damage, which is, add $200 billion in property damage to the cost of the Climate Act, and you've doubled it almost already. But the bigger picture is hundreds of people died. There are times I get frustrated, and I want to say, fine, let's go through with this. Let's have the blackouts, then people will see. But every time I start to think that, I start to go, no, because those blackouts aren't just inconvenient. They kill people. And we can't have that. All right, next slide. There we are, last slide. This is the way forward. We need to keep emphasizing the absolute critical requirement for energy reliability. If you do not have reliable electricity, you're a third world country. That is one of the major factors distinguishing developing countries from fully developed countries. We have power all the time, except in big storms. Things happen. The world is not perfect. But in developing countries, they may have it a few hours a day. They may have it very intermittently. They just never really know for sure if they're going to turn on the switch and have power. That means kids can't study for school. It means businesses can't be as effective. Any business owners here? Few? Yeah. What happens when the power goes out? Right? A lot of stuff gets shut down, and it really affects people's lives. So we need to kind of keep focusing on making sure we have reliable, dispatchable sources of power until we can find these alternatives to back them up. And that means anything that works. Now, not everybody agrees with me. I'm personally a big supporter of nuclear power. I think New York ought to be welcoming these new experiments that are being done in several states with small modular reactors. They're very safe. They're much cheaper than these big monstrous nuclear reactors that we've had a history of building. The 50 megawatt reactor can power a town by itself. You can add a couple together to power a bigger town. And the energy is always there. And it's emissions free. Does not contribute any greenhouse gases. All right, so my time's up. Do we have time for any questions, or are we too pressed for time? Okay, we'll hold the questions till the end. I'll still be around. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Sarah Traberman, representing Sensible Solar for rural New York. Sensible Solar for rural New York is a coalition of concerned citizens in rural Columbia County and among opposed to the Shepherd's Run solar project, a proposed 265-acre industrial-sized solar installation to be sited near the New York State Route 23, Route 7, and Route 11A in Curryville and Copake, and adjacent to the Deconic Hills Consolidated School and Copake Lake community. Sensible Solar for rural New York supports solar energy and the creation of renewable energy sources in the state of New York. They are opposed, as does local laws and scale and site of the proposed Shepherd Run 265-acre utility solar project. Let's hear it for Sarah.
You hear me? Oh, shoot. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Traberman. I'm glad to be here. I want to thank Folding Chairs and Neighbors to Neighbors for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity to tell you what's going on in Copake with the proposed solar project and about our group, Sensible Solar. For those of you who aren't familiar with Copake, it's a town in Columbia County. It's about 40 miles north of here. And to give you a better sense of the area and the proposed project, I want to start by showing you a short video. cue the video. Now that you have some background, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the major issues with the project and why New York State laws and policy regarding renewable energy siting are a problem. I'd like to start by telling you about Sensible Solar. Next slide. The group was formed in 2019. It's a grassroots, nonpartisan group of private citizens who came together because we had a lot of questions and concerns about Shepherd's Run, and we weren't getting clear answers. From the beginning, we've acknowledged that climate change is a serious problem and that development of solar energy is part of the solution. But we grew concerned that the project coming together in Copiague seemed to be more about maximizing profits for the developer and not so much about respecting our local laws and community. We wanted to get the facts, not just the talking points from the developer. It seemed to us that New York State had flung open the door to private developers with no master plan in place to guide the development and protect rural communities where these projects will be built. Really, what's happening is a green gold rush. Private developers are grabbing as much land as they can so they can take advantage of New York State's one-sided regulations that favor developers but fail to protect local communities from renewable energy developments. We spent a lot of time early on raising awareness about what was going on, and this was back in early 2020 when COVID hit. It was a scary time. Everybody was just focused on COVID, so a lot of what we had to do was bring awareness to the community about this project. In our conversations with people, they told us they were concerned about protecting the things that make Copake special: farmland, natural resources, wildlife, the Taconic watershed, and our tourism-based economy. Sensible Solar is a voice for those concerns. Copake, like most towns, had enacted a comprehensive plan and a farmland protection plan. This was back in 2011 and 2014, way before the solar project even started. These plans both focus on the importance of protecting farmland and open space, planning and directing development away from these resources, and preserving the town's rural character. This is what's important to the people of Copake, and everything Sensible Solar does is 100% in support of the town and these goals. We believe local laws must be respected. I think we all know that New York is a home rule state. This means that towns have the right to exercise control over matters of local concern. For example, zoning laws that prohibit development in certain areas. The state should not override those laws for renewable energy projects, but they do. We're fighting to make sure New York State takes local interests seriously, which unfortunately they are not required to do according to current regulations. Next slide, please. So the project is a 60 megawatt industrial scale solar energy project. It will fill an entire valley in Craryville, which is a hamlet within Copake. It will have 220,000 motor-driven solar panels on 265 acres. The private for-profit developer is Hecate Energy, based in Chicago, and 40% owned by Repsol, which is Spain's national oil company. The project will be sited on prime farmland, which will be removed from use for the life of the project. It calls for clear-cutting 40 acres of forest on a very visible hillside. The entire project is sited within the Taconic watershed. The Taconic Creek is part of the watershed and is a source of drinking water for the city of Hudson. Within the watershed are 21 wetlands and 9 protected streams. The town has a law that says you can't build anything within 100 feet of water, but the developer wants that waived so they can put in more panels and drill underneath for underwater electrical cables. As you saw in the video, the project will come right up to the football field of the Taconic Hills School, as well as the access routes into Copake Lake, which is an important tourist spot and recreation area. It also is right up to the border of the 1,000-acre protected Rhinestrom Hill Audubon Sanctuary. Next slide, please. To continue, this isn't just one solar field, it is 7 separate solar fields which sprawl across highways, around roads, through neighborhoods, up hillsides, and around streams and creeks. The project directly borders over 100 homes and local businesses. The Taconic Hill School is on the oval on the left, and you can see the panels come right up behind it. There are at least 10 identified historic properties on the site, 4 of which are eligible to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And the New York State Office of Historic Preservation has made a determination that the project would have an adverse impact on these 4 properties. Doesn't matter. The site will surround the Niver Cemetery on Route 23. This cemetery is one of the oldest in the county, and it contains graves of Revolutionary War soldiers. There's also an historic site connected with the Mohican Indians within the project area. Bottom line, you'd be hard-pressed to pick a more complicated and difficult place to site a solar facility. So why was this site chosen? 2 reasons. 1, a large part of the acreage is owned by one individual who is willing to sign a lease with the developer, and that parcel sits directly across this electrical substation that's already there on Route 23. So that means it's cheaper for the developer to connect to the grid. Next slide, please. So now that you know more about the project, it's easy to understand why it's wrong. As we see it, there are no benefits and only negatives. Let's start with jobs. There'll be no new permanent jobs created, even though all of these developers and the state will talk about jobs that are being created by renewable energy projects. The construction's going to be done by out-of-state contractors, and those jobs are temporary anyway. And once built, maybe there will be one job to make sure the project is operating the way it's supposed to. The town won't receive additional revenue since New York State offers tax breaks to developers for green energy projects. These arrangements replace local property taxes with payments at a reduced rate, which is decided in Albany. It's basically a state giveaway to out-of-state developers, and it takes money away from local governments that are forced to accept these projects. We're not benefiting from lower electricity rates either. The 94C regulations contain a formula for an energy credit to homeowners, but the way we calculate it, that number comes out to $22 a year per household. This is not a real benefit. Property values will go down. Logically, it makes sense because if you look out your window and you see farms and fields, that's one thing. And if you look out your window and you see glass and steel, that's another. And there are 2 studies that we know of that confirm that there is a reduction in values for properties near solar installations. The project violates town zoning laws because it's within the agricultural and rural residential area, which limits the size of commercial developments like this. All told, Hecate has requested relief from 18 local laws, and for all of these violations, their explanation as to why they should get a waiver is either that the compliance with the law will cost more money for them, or it will result in them not being able to build enough to supply the 60 megawatts of power. Another problem is that this project will hurt the local economy, which depends on agriculture and tourism. Those are Copiague's 2 big attractions, and industrial solar detracts from both of them. Next slide. The project removes hundreds of acres of the most productive farmland, probably forever. So there's always talk about, well, after the 20 years, we're going to return the land to farmland. Now, that's highly unlikely. I mean, which farmers are going to hang around for 20 years waiting for the land to be returned to farmland? And secondly, I don't understand why that would happen anyway, because are we suddenly not going to need solar energy in 20 years? So once the farmland is taken over by solar panels, it's gone forever. We question how the project will impact soil erosion and sediment runoff into waterways, especially where the hills will be leveled, and how this might impact our streams and wetlands. We're concerned about impacts to the aquifers that supply our wells from the drilling Hecate wants to do under the water. 40 acres of trees and shrubs will be cut on hillsides, and the hills will be leveled, all to give the developer more acreage to make its 60 megawatts of power. All these lands will be surrounded by fencing, which then impacts wildlife habitats, migration paths, and breeding areas that are critical to maintaining a key wildlife passage for the entire Northeast. And we will have to deal with a year of construction over more than 300 acres with the building of access roads and staging areas. It's going to be a mess. And beyond all the construction noise for a year, once operable, there will be buzzing inverters and motors that continuously move the panels to face the sun. The noise will definitely have an impact, and we've written a letter asking many questions about the developer's noise and vibration analysis and have gotten no answers. Needless to say, the project changes our scenic views forever. No one will ever be removing all that glass and steel. Next slide, please. What concerns us is that when we raise any issues about impacts to the environment, we're told that solar is perfectly safe and there's nothing to worry about. But here's a real-world example that things can and do go wrong with solar installations. What you're looking at on the left is the Chattahoochee River in Alabama. A private developer was building a large solar installation nearby, and during construction, sediment that had been taken from the ground washed into nearby waterways. This caused problems with the drinking water in a nearby town, which had to clean all that mud out of the water supply. In November 2022, after 4 years of investigations, the U.S. Department of Justice and the EPA settled with AL Solar and 3 other developers over their violations of the Clean Water Act and were fined over $1 million. Looking at the map on the right, you can see Shepherd's Run in red within the circle. This is right in the middle of the Taconic watershed. The Taconic Creek flows from the project area southwest and is diverted to the Hudson City Reservoir, shown on the bottom left of the map. The reservoir supplies drinking water for the city. We don't want what happens in Alabama to happen here, and we're concerned. Next slide, please.
Sarah? Just a 5-minute warning on the timing.
Got it.
Thank you.
So now I'm going to talk about the permitting process. The permitting process for larger renewable energy projects was created as part of the 2020 budget package during the Cuomo administration. The law is known as 94C. 94C effectively takes away all manner of local input and decision-making and hands it to a single office, reporting to the governor, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, or ORAS. 94C overrides the basic right of municipalities to adopt and enforce local zoning laws they deem appropriate, and substitutes the judgment of individuals who neither reside in nor are familiar with our towns. ORAS gets to make all the decisions, and they can ignore local laws in deciding whether to grant a permit. Usually, when developers ask for a waiver, as I had said before, it was because it's going to cost them too much money or they won't be able to build the project. But ORAS is allowed it can decide that local law is unduly burdensome and waive it for the developer so the project can be built. The state taxes paid by the developer are decided by the state, not the local community, and ORAS is not required to respond to any public questions or comments. We've asked lots of questions and made lots of comments. We've never gotten an answer from them. Bottom line, the point of 94C was to fast-track applications and impose the will of the state on local communities in order to build projects faster. To date, ORAS has not turned down any project applications under 94C, so unfortunately, it seems to be working as planned. And to us, it seems New York State cares more about private developers than they do about its own citizens. Because I'm running out of time, let's skip the next slide. Yeah. So in summary, what our position is, it's very simple. We stand with the town of Copiague and oppose Shepherd's Run as currently proposed because it's enormous, it's poorly sited, it overrules home rule and town authority, it conflicts with all of our local conservation plans, it will result in the industrialization of our rural community, which nobody wants. And by the way, we've gotten close to 400 comments on the site, as well as 4,700 signatures on a change.org petition, and the vast majority of those comments are against this project as currently proposed. We see no benefits and only negatives with the project. Hecate will be the only winner with big profits courtesy of New York State. Next slide. So what needs to happen? New York State has to honor home rule and respect upstate towns' priorities. We think the permit application process is flawed and must be changed to include local decision-making. Having ORAS with sole authority is problematic. It reports to no one but the governor and can overrule local law. We need more emphasis on community protection, and we think if New York State was really serious about climate change and community protection, they would create a statewide master siting plan which protects farmland, water, historic properties in neighborhoods from bad developments. So we urge you to stay informed and don't take private developers' assurances that they're doing good things for your community. It's a lot of PR because for developers, it's all about making money. Stand with your local leaders, not Albany. You know what's best for your own communities. And we must all voice our concerns to political representatives and ORAS, but most loudly to our elected state assembly members and senators who should be guiding this process and enacting proper oversight of these developments to protect local communities. Next slide. And just so you know where things stand with Shepherd's Run, Hecate initially filed their application for a permit in March 2022. ORS kicked the application back 3 times, most recently in March, and so we expect them to refile again at the end of June, and we're waiting to see what that looks like, and we'll be looking through it and analyzing it and continuing to push back because we're not going to give up. So, thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next speaker is Bobbie Ann Cox, who's an attorney in New York, practicing for over 25 years, as well as a fellow at the Brownstone Institute. She is best known for her recent victory in striking down the New York State quarantine camp regulation issued by Governor Hochul and her Department of Health. Bobbie Ann is seeking similar tactics and strategies used to skirt the existing regulations for public health, being employed by the governor to override or change regulations in the areas of housing and the environment. Today, or tonight, she will share more information about that. And Bobbie Ann's been a frequent guest here, starting back last year when she informed us of what was going on. So.
Hi, everybody. Whoa. Great to see you. Thanks for having me. My name is Bobbie Ann Cox. I'm an attorney here in New York. I'm in Westchester County. And I last year brought a lawsuit against Governor Hochul. I'll just tell you that real quick to give you an update. Does everybody know about the quarantine lawsuit? Pretty much. So last year, on behalf of a group of New York State legislators, Senator George Borrello, Assemblyman Chris Tague, Assemblyman Mike Lawler, who's now Congressman Mike Lawler, and a citizens group called Uniting New York State, I sued Governor Hochul and her Department of Health over an isolation and quarantine regulation, which basically allowed the Department of Health to pick and choose which New Yorkers they could lock up or lock down. They could have locked you up in your home, or they could have removed you from your home by force of police and taken you to a facility of their choosing. There was no time restriction, so you could have been there for days or weeks or months. There was no age restriction, so they could have done this to you, but they also could have done this to your child or your grandchild or your ailing parent. And there was language in there that said that they could tell you what you could and couldn't do while you were in lockup or lockdown. So pretty scary stuff. And they didn't have to prove that you were sick. So there was nothing in the provision, there was no provision in that regulation that said that they had to prove you were either infected with a communicable disease or that you were exposed to a communicable disease. So we sued, we argued separation of powers, we won the lawsuit in July of last year. The court struck it down, said it was unconstitutional, and determined that it was null and void and could not be enforced or repromulgated. So after about 8 months, conveniently after the elections in November, Hochul decided to appeal. So we are now entwined in an appeal in the 4th Department, which is up in Rochester. So we just filed our brief last week, and we're waiting for their response, and then we will have oral arguments in September up in Rochester. So if you want to follow the case, we do have flyers. I brought flyers tonight that Uniting New York State made up, and there's a website specifically about the lawsuit, and you can get those flyers in the back at the table. I also have some up here that I can pass around when I'm done speaking. But it's really great to stay informed if you sign up for Uniting NYS emails. They send one email newsletter each week, and it updates you not just on the quarantine lawsuit, but it updates you on a lot of things that are going on in Albany. So that's the update on the quarantine lawsuit. I'm wanting to talk to you briefly tonight about some other things going on which tie into what we just heard from the first 2 speakers tonight. So I think we clearly see that we are having our way of life attacked by our government, which is a pretty scary thing, right? They want to tell us you have to drive electric cars. They want to tell us that you have to live in all electric homes. They want to tell us that you cannot any longer use fossil fuels. They want to tell you where you can and cannot go, and if you have to lock down in your house or go into a facility of their choosing. I mean, it has become very obvious that the government in New York is completely out of control. The reason they are completely out of control is because one party has a supermajority in both houses, okay? One party rule is very, very dangerous. I don't care what party it is. It just happens to be the Democrats in New York for the past 5 years. They have a supermajority in the Assembly, they have a supermajority in the Senate, they have the governor's mansion, and they have the Attorney General's office. So that means you are hearing one side of the story every day, all day. The Republicans have no say. They can propose bills, but they're going to go nowhere. And because there's a supermajority of Democrats, if the Democrats pass a bill and it goes to the governor's desk and the governor doesn't want to sign it, she doesn't have to sign it, but then it can go back to them and they can override her veto. So it is super dangerous. So that needs to change. I'll talk a little bit about what we can do to change that at the end, but that is the root of the cause of what's going on in New York. When one party has no opposition, they get pretty brazen in how they act, and the people are suffering as a result. So how did we get where we are right now? How did the government become so overwhelmingly powerful in our state? Really, there are three reasons. Propaganda. We hear a lot of propaganda going on. Censorship. We don't hear two sides of the story because mainstream media only covers one side of the story. And then we're seeing collusion between government actors and private industry. So a great way to think about the collusion that I'm referring to is, if you have, let's say, special interests that are lobbying our lawmakers in Albany, and they're saying, oh, we want you to vote for this. We want you to pass this law that allows renewable energy or requires renewable energy. The legislators are supposed to represent all of us. They're not supposed to represent special interests. And so we need to break that chain, because right now they are really only representing special interests. And we have to stop that, because if we don't, this is what we're going to see. We're going to see laws being passed or regulations being issued that favor big anything, right? Big developers, big pharma, big media, big everything. And the little guy, the people, the voters, are not going to be heard, and they're not going to be listened to. And that's exactly what's happening right now. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what's going on. And when I say propaganda, how the government twists words to make it sound really great. And then what they, in reality, are going to do is quite detrimental to us. So, for example, they like to say, oh, yeah, we're gonna end poverty, we're going to be fair, we're going to be equitable. Okay, so what do they really mean? Well, they want to redistribute your wealth, and they want to create political elite classes where rules for thee and not for me, right? So they can do what they want. They can drive whatever cars they want. They can live in whatever kind of houses they want. They don't have to live in these condensed, Hochul housing, the housing compact that they were trying to shove into the budget, which would have required basically 3% growth in every neighborhood for housing over the next 10 years, and it would have increased housing by like 800,000 units over the next several years. they wouldn't have to live there, but everybody else would have to live there, right? So how did they put this? They try and make it, sound great, equity, inclusion. What did they really do? Well, in 2019, for example, Cuomo passed a law, along with the legislature up in Albany, to change the eviction laws in New York State. So what was one thing that they changed in that law? Well, the 30-day notice to evict your non-paying tenant became a 90-day notice, right? So now the landlords have to float their properties for 3 months before they can start eviction proceedings, which take another typically 6 months or so. So it was a direct attack on the property owners, right? Eviction moratorium in New York, that started with the federal government, and they said the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, told every person in the United States of America, if you are a property owner and you rent out your property, you cannot evict your tenant for non-payment of rent because it'll spread COVID. And then New York State Legislature picked that up and made their own law. So that when the federal one got struck down by SCOTUS, a year and a half later, that happened in the spring of 2020. It took a year and a half for the United States Supreme Court to strike it down as unconstitutional because it was thoroughly unconstitutional. New York State then passed its own law, which continued the eviction moratorium up until, a few months ago. So you had landlords in New York State who, by the way, most landlords in our country are mom and pop shops. They're people that, worked their whole lives to purchase properties, and then they live in part of it, and then they rent out another part, and that income that they're getting from their tenants helps them pay their bills and put food on their table. They basically said, well, yeah, you don't have to pay rent because you can't get evicted. So people stopped paying rent. And they were getting checks in from the government, from the CARES Act. And what happened? Landlords were losing their properties in record numbers. They were either dumping them for fractions of the property values that they actually were, or they were going belly up. My expertise before was real estate law. I did real estate law for 20 years, property tax certiorari, and my phone was ringing off the hook starting in the spring of 2020 when this was implemented by the government. The property owners couldn't hold on to their properties. What am I going to do? There's no moratorium on taxes. There's no moratorium on my mortgage. There's no moratorium on my maintenance of my property. So this was a direct attack on the middle class, the little guys. Christmas jeer is what we call this one. 2 or 3 days before Christmas this past year, Albany went back into session. So Albany actually, our legislature goes from January to June, the first week in June. That's it. It's a part-time job. They are in session 60 days out of 365 days in a year. So they got called back into session in December, a couple days before Christmas, while everybody was getting ready for their holidays, because, well, does anybody know why they went back in? Yes. They decided to give themselves another 30% raise. So their pay was $79,000 a year, and then in 2018, they raised it, they gave themselves a 30% raise to $110,000 a year. And then 5 years later, just last year, they gave themselves another 30% raise. So they now make $142,000 a year for working 60 days. Plus they get per diems and benefits and stuff like that. And the other thing they passed in December in that same law was that you are prohibited, if you're a New York State legislator, you're prohibited from having outside income. So you can't work a job other than being a legislator if you make more than $35,000 a year. So what have they done? They have now required that every New York State legislator be a career politician. You can't be a citizen legislator anymore. You can't be a farmer. You can't be a doctor, you can't be a lawyer, you can't be a pharmacist, you can't be an insurance agent and be a legislator. No, you have to become fully dependent on your job as a legislator, which makes you now more fully dependent on getting reelected. Because now if you don't get reelected, what's your job going to be? You gave up your farm, you gave up your law practice, you gave up your doctor, your medicine practice. So now you can only be a legislator. So now you really want to get reelected. So now you're really going to listen to your special interest buddies that are writing you checks, right? So this is what they did while everybody was getting ready for Christmas and Hanukkah in December. Sustainable agriculture. That sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Sounds really great. So what do they really want to do when they say sustainable agriculture? What do they really want to do is increase food shortages, right? We already don't make enough food to feed ourselves in this country. We already have to import food, but they want it to get even worse. What are they doing? Ties into what we heard earlier tonight. Solar farms taking over lots of areas, rural areas in New York State. So New York State boasts over 188,000 projects since 2020. Since 2020. That doesn't count 2023. They have bills that are being proposed in both the Assembly and the Senate that would declare a climate emergency and ban fossil fuel infrastructure projects. Okay, so everything would go electric, as we heard before. These are their goals. These are their goals. Everything's going to go electric. Okay, so then it becomes harder to sustain, right? If we don't have enough electric, what do? Now we have brownouts, now we have blackouts, and we heard earlier from Dr. Hanley, those kill people. There's a bill, one in the Assembly, a sister bill in the Senate. They want all electric buildings. So they want all buildings to be all electric in New York State. Again, complete drain on the grid. We cannot sustain that. And didn't we just see what happened in upstate, I don't know if you remember, in western New York last winter, when there was that horrific storm? People died. Dozens of people died because they didn't have electricity and they didn't have the heat that they needed. I mean, it was horrific. And here they are saying, well, everything should be, all the houses should be electric, all the buildings should be electric. Okay, I'm going to skip some because I know I have limited time. Okay, so along the same line with the environmental stuff, they say let's do sustainable energy for all, right? What do they mean? Increase the taxes on fossil fuels, caps on usage controlled by the smart meters. I don't know if you guys have smart meters yet in Dutchess, yes, because we have them in Westchester. They came in, our energy is supplied by Con Edison, and they came in over the past couple years, literally house by house, and they said, oh, don't worry, you don't have to pay anything, we're going to upgrade you to a smart meter. And so now they can track your usage, everything, they don't have to come read the meters anymore, there's no digital anymore, everything's electronic. And in my bill each month, I don't know if you've noticed this, if you look at your bill, it rates you and it tells you either you're doing a good job and it has a smiley face, or you're doing not really a great job and there's just a straight face, or you're doing a really bad job because you're using too much electricity and there's a frown. Look at your bill. So if they don't like that, they could just, if it's an all-electric house, they could just flip the switch if you're using too much energy. You can't do that. The gas stove ban. Yeah, you guys heard about that, right? Yeah, they snuck that one into the budget. So I'm not sure if I have to keep giving examples, but we need to take back our power, because what has happened, especially over the last 3 years, thanks to COVID, is that the government screamed and shouted, pandemic, fear. They scared everybody to death in conjunction with the mainstream media. And it was like, there's an emergency. Give us your power. Give us your power. We'll protect you. We'll keep you safe. But we're not going to give the power back when we're done. So we saw that across the state in every element of your life. They were telling you what to wear, masks on your face. They were telling you where you could and couldn't go when they shut down all of the synagogues and houses of worship across the state. They put them in, Cuomo created zones, colored zones, if you remember that, back in 2020 and 21. And he said, well, this zone is red, this zone is yellow, this zone is green. And if you're in a red zone, you can only have 10 people in your house of worship at one time. Now, there are houses of worship, particularly in New York City, near where I live, that can seat like 1,000 people at once. But you can only have 10 people in there because the governor said so. 100% unconstitutional, ridiculous, and it was struck down. It was struck down by the United States Supreme Court. We saw attacks on, well, they tried to do the quarantine regulation, but I shut that down before they started pulling people out of their houses. We saw this complete overreach by the government during COVID, in the name of COVID, in the name of emergency. The Constitution is not suspended during time of emergency. The Constitution is more important during time of emergency because that's when the government's going to try and overstep, right? So we have to get back. We have to get back to the idea that the people are in charge. The government doesn't tell the people what to do. The people tell the government what to do. And when they don't listen, you vote them out. That is the way the government, that our society works. They are not listening anymore. They are not listening anymore. They are listening to their special interest groups. They're listening to the people that write the checks for their campaigns because they love the power and they don't want to lose the power. However, there are 19 million New Yorkers. There are more than 19 million New Yorkers now, but let's stick with 19 million. In the last gubernatorial race, which was just in November, I think it was like 3 or 4 million voted. Come on, guys. 3 or 4 million voted. And Hochul won by like 300,000 votes. Okay, I think we can do a lot better than that. We need voter registration drives. We need to educate the voters about these types of issues so that they will actually get up off the couch and go and vote. Ballot harvesting is legal in New York State. Ballot harvesting is when you go and collect other people's ballots and then deliver them. The Democrats do it, the Republicans don't. You have to play the game if you're going to win. And I'm not being political here. Nothing that I'm talking about is political. If you don't want to be locked up in a quarantine facility, it doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican, independent, liberal, conservative, or whatever. We're talking about being an American and having rights that the government is not allowed to take away. So, what we need to do is get rid of all the ones in Albany who are not listening anymore, who are listening to their special interest paychecks instead of to the people. And we need to do it in an organized and concerted effort. There are only 11 seats that need to be flipped in the New York State Senate for the Republicans to gain control of the New York State Senate. Some of them just barely lost in November. I think one race was like 10 votes. The Republican lost by like 10 votes. If you have the Senate majority Republican and then you have the Assembly majority Democrat, now they have to talk. Now you have to have two sides of the equation. Now you have to negotiate and meet in the middle. And that's the way it's supposed to work. But we haven't had that in New York for 5 years. So we have to now get it back. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying I hope that before you leave, everybody will take one of the flyers for Uniting NYS. Go on the website, sign up for the weekly newsletter. I write a Substack, which is, if you sign up for my Substack, you'll automatically get an email once a week when I write an article. So please sign up for that. I have my business cards here tonight. I'm happy to give everybody a card. It's so important to stay informed about, number one, what's going on, so you can spread that information, but also number two, when we have a call to action. If there's something important going on, if we're going to do a voter registration drive, or we're going to do, if it's election time, and we're going to do get out the vote initiatives, it's so important to stay involved and stay up to date so that you can be involved and you can grab 5 friends to be involved as well. There's no more time to be apolitical. I was apolitical for a long time. Didn't want to hear it, didn't want to know what was going on. But what happens is, if you keep doing that for too long, you wake up one day and you have no more rights. So we need to all stand up. We need to all do something. We don't have to all be giving speeches all over New York State or, bringing lawsuits. You can do little tiny things. You can make phone calls. You can do emails. You can post on social media. For the quarantine lawsuit, we have on unitingnys.com, we have flyers about the lawsuit. You can specifically made for social media. Download the flyer and post it on your social media. Help raise awareness. It should be front page news across the country that a group of New York State legislators sues the governor who wants to lock people up for no reason for an undefined amount of time. The court strikes it down and she's appealing. And that's not headline news. It's horrific. It's horrific. We need to generate the groundswell from the bottom up. And then we need to replace the leadership at the top who's no longer listening to us. It's a really simple equation. We just need the bodies to do it. I can't do it by myself. I tried last year, it didn't work. So we need to all kind of get together and be a part of it. I know it's overwhelming. I'm going to end on this note. I know it's overwhelming. I was talking to somebody on the way up here and they were saying, they're hitting us from all sides. They are. They're coming after your livelihoods. They're coming after your social lives. They're coming after your family lives. They are trying to remake this society to how they want it to be. It gets overwhelming. Trust me, I get overwhelmed often about it. But when you get overwhelmed, don't just turn it off and walk away and stick your head in the sand. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, count to 10, and remember that God put us in this moment in history for a reason. We have to take advantage of that. If not for ourselves, for our children. So thank you all for having me tonight. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Bobbie Ann. Always a crowd pleaser. Why don't I get the speakers up here and we'll take some questions. If you have questions and you didn't get your card picked up, just raise it up in the air and someone will come around and collect it from you. The first question is for Sarah, so as soon as Sarah can come up here, I'll read the question. It says, why have state and federal elected officials have not come to the support of local communities opposing oversized development?
Okay. There have been some people that have written a letter here and there and things like that, but generally it's very difficult to find any elected official who is going to actually say, this is wrong, what's happening, because the movement to decarbonize and the CLCPA goals, it's just, they can't go against it. They'll be labeled climate change deniers or whatever. And so, they sympathize with what we're going through. They'll write a letter to ORAS or whatever, but no one is really going to take a hard stand. And believe me, we hound these people. And we try to get meetings, but it's very difficult. And that's why. It's because it's like this train has left the station and there's no turning back, but we're going to still fight it.
Next one's for Bobbie Ann. I remember you mentioning people are fleeing New York State and how our communities are getting smaller and smaller. I still know many people who will agree with us, but have not jumped on your work. Card's all a little scribbly, but how can we spread the word more efficiently and get people to look up to real activists like you?
So that's a really great question because I would love for people to get involved. The number one way to help is to help spread the word, whether that means online, if people are on social media, or if you're in group texts or group email chats. Take a link. If you go to my website, Cox Lawyers, it's COX Lawyers with an S.com. I have a media section on the Cox Lawyers website, and I have a ton of interviews that I've done, articles that I've written, articles that have been written about the quarantine lawsuit. Just take the link to any one of those and either post it on your social media or share it in emails or share it in your text message chains. That's the way we're going to get the word out. Another way to get involved is to sign up to volunteer at unitingnys.com, because I work very closely with that citizens group. So they help promote events that I'm going to speak at. They help me get speaking engagements. Another way to get involved and to support is there's a donate button on my website, coxlawyers.com. I'm doing the quarantine lawsuit pro bono, so donations are much appreciated. And there's also a donate button on unitingnys.com that is a completely 100% volunteer-driven organization. And another way to get involved is to reach out to your lawmakers, your state senator, your state assembly member, and tell them, hey, because a lot of them, believe it or not, don't even know what's going on. A lot of them don't know things that are happening in other committees in Albany, and they don't know anything about my quarantine lawsuit. So bringing awareness to everyone, including the legislators, can really be helpful, because then they can start using their platforms to talk about these things. So yeah, that'd be great. I'd love more support.
So this one's not addressed to anybody in particular, but I just want to let you know, we're not talking about global warming tonight. We're not talking about CO2 emissions and stuff like that. So there were a couple of questions. We're not asking those questions for tonight. But this question, again, no heading. What can we do to stop them from implementing this atrocity? So anybody want to take a stab at it? I don't know which atrocity. So I don't know if it's your atrocity or your atrocity. So. Well, he's got.
A voluntary.
Well, you can think about that one. So I'll go to Dr. Hanley's. Has anybody asked the citizens of New York how they feel about all of this?
Yes. The Alliance for Clean Energy, which admittedly is an organization from the fossil fuel industry, they did a survey that was conducted by Siena College, and Siena College is actually very respected. Siena College's survey organization is very respected. The polling guru Nate Silver gives them like an A rating, so they're very reliable. And I look closely at the survey. I used to teach survey research, and they ask good questions. And what they showed was that overwhelmingly, about 3/4 of New Yorkers are very concerned about climate change and want to do something. But it also showed that most of them are not willing to pay very much. When you start asking people to pay about $20 a month, only about 1/3 are willing to pay that much on the utility bills to fight climate change. And they'll say, that in one of the questions they said, yes, we need to get rid of gas stoves, but then when you ask them about getting rid of their own gas stoves, suddenly a majority are like, no, not mine. I don't want to give up my gas stove. When they asked, do you think that New Yorkers can afford this? Something like 3/4 said we're very concerned about whether New Yorkers can afford these policies. So yeah, there's a survey out there. You can look it up. Just look up New Yorkers for Affordable Energy, Siena College survey. You should be able to find it. I actually wrote about it on the Empire Center website. I think it's called Climate of Confusion Surrounds Climate Act. So you could Google that, and I talked about it. So yeah, people have been asked, and people want something to be done for climate change, but they're very concerned about the costs, and they're very concerned about how it's going to affect them personally.
This next one is for Sarah. Is community opposition impacting the development of large-scale renewable energy facilities and impeding the ability to meet the CLCPA goals?
I mean, I think yes, and it's not just in New York. I mean, there's a lot of opposition across the country, and I know that, you know, some of the renewable energy industry consultants and things like that are very worried about it, very concerned that it's going to, you know, cause slowdowns in some of these projects, which I'm happy about. But, you know, there's a mistake in not having regulations that include community input, because I think, you know, if the community wants the project and has some input into how it gets done in their own community, that's good for everybody. So it's kind of a yes and no answer.
Next one for Bobbie Ann. Please address the quarantine camp in New Paltz and in our area.
Yeah, so I've been asked about that before. I am not aware of any quarantine camps that have been constructed. One thing about the regulation, though, is that the state didn't need to construct any camps. The regulation said that they could use any building anywhere they wanted. So they could have used your apartment building, they could have used a hotel, they could have used a prison, they could have used a multifamily house. So they didn't even need to raise any money to build anything or, you know, put shovel to soil. It was pretty well thought out. If anybody wants to read the actual regulation, it is on the unitingnys.com website. You just click on the lawsuit tab, and then you'll see the judge's decision. You click the link, and you can read the judge's decision from last year, and it actually has the regulation he put it in his decision. And I have those flyers for Uniting NYS here up in the front. I don't know if you want to maybe just pass them around or something, but they're sitting right here next to Phil. There's a lot of information actually on that website, not just about the quarantine case, but about other things going on. The attack on parental rights in this state is outrageous. It's outrageous. I was just in Albany on Tuesday. The Assembly Health Committee passed a bill that would allow children of any age to get STD shots without their parents' consent or knowledge. So a 9-year-old could go into a medical facility and say, I'd like to get a shot for HIV or whatever, without the parents knowing. There was another bill that is in the New York State Legislature right now that would require, there's one in the Senate and one in the Assembly, which means it's gaining a lot of speed here. It would require all schools in New York State to teach comprehensive sexual education to all children starting in kindergarten. 5-year-olds will learn about sex education because your government is going to tell them about it. Parents don't get to decide anymore how they educate their child about sex or when. So this is what's going on. People, how do we stop this? That question that you asked before, Dean, that was that general question. How do we stop this from happening? Get active. Get active. I don't care what you do. Become a social media warrior. Go on social media and blast things out all day long. Go to Albany. There are rallies that happen in Albany to fight these things. Go to Albany and meet with your legislators. If you live around here, you're not that far from Albany. Go and meet with your legislators. Tell them what you think about these horrific bills. If they don't hear from you, they don't think you care. Trust me. Trust me, it works when you pick up the phone. It works when you send an email. It works when you write a letter. I know many legislators in Albany. It works. We just have to get more involved and more vocal. We really do. Please.
So I think we only want to do a couple more questions to leave some time. We have to be out of here at 9 o'clock, so want to give you time to collect information at the back table and everything else. For James Hanley, please enumerate the problems that you see and have written about in the current legislation.
I can't do that and get us out of here by 9 o'clock. But in terms of current legislation, I think my biggest concern right now is where we're going to end up with this cap and invest program. And part of what bothers me is the legislature has developed this habit of passing laws that are sort of empty, then handing it over to a special committee or to one of the bureaucratic agencies and say, here, you guys write the actual details of it, which is what they did with the Climate Act and the Climate Action Council. It's a way for the legislature to do good-sounding things while escaping any of the responsibility for the details of it, where things get more controversial. And with the cap and invest program, which is designed to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases by putting a cap on the total amount that can be emitted by businesses in the state, and then reducing that cap every year, and businesses will have to buy emission allowances at auction and then figure out how to cut their own emissions year over year. Several problems with it. Now, I want to emphasize these types of programs have been proven to reduce emissions more quickly and more inexpensively than any other way when they're done right. But the ones that have worked are ones that have been more nationwide. And that's because it's a little bit harder for a business to say, well, you know, we're going to move out of the country than it is to say we're going to move out of New York. Or if you want to start a business, you would go, well, yeah, I live in the United States. I guess this is where I'm going to, you know, put my business. And if a business does move, some countries are starting to look at, I can't think of the term they're using, but they're starting to look at if a business moves out of country, then they're going to put a tariff on their imported goods equal to the amount of emissions that they're emitting in that other country, you know, to balance it all out. We can't do that in New York. Right? We're not supposed to just reduce the emissions in New York. We're supposed to reduce the emissions overall, which means we can't just ship them out of state to, say, Pennsylvania and have the business keep emitting the same amount and say, yay, victory. That's not what the Climate Act calls for. And so with the cap and invest program, there's a real incentive if it starts getting very expensive, if the limit on emissions comes down too quickly for businesses to be able to adapt to, they're going to say, well, Pennsylvania's right next door. Why don't I move my business there? Or any business in the country that's looking to expand or set up a new facility somewhere, they're going to look around and go, well, why would I do New York? It's going to be too difficult to do business there. And the other thing is, we don't know the details of it yet, so I don't want to say this is how it's going to be, but a lot of the people supporting this program don't want to allow businesses to trade emissions allowances. Most of these programs traditionally have been cap and trade. If my business can reduce emissions faster than we expected, cheaper than we expected, we have some extra emissions permits left over, I can sell them to your business where you're having a more difficult time meeting your emissions allowances, and you benefit and I benefit, right? And the emissions still come down. And a lot of people saying, no, we don't want to allow businesses to do that, which puts an extra burden on businesses. So pay close attention to, hard to pay close attention because it's going to happen behind closed doors at the Department of Environmental Conservation. But to the extent you can, pay attention to what they're doing at this Cap and Invest program. It's going to impose huge costs. I was talking about the cost per gallon of gasoline, the extra cost for natural gas, and that doesn't even get into the costs on businesses of trying to comply with this. So I believe, as somebody who studied economics, I believe in these Cap and Invest programs on a national level. On a state level, I think they're absolutely foolish. California's been trying to do it. They're losing business out of state. It's not that the businesses are necessarily picking up and moving all their business out of state, but they're moving facilities and building new facilities in other states, right? California's missing out on that business. Washington State started doing it. Too soon to see how it's going to work out for them, but I don't know. Why would you start a business in New York State if it's going to be having any greenhouse gas emissions at all? And New York will be next on that list, I think.
Next question is to Sarah. How does towns justify the precedent that's going to be set by allowing these laws to be broken and go through? So if they're ruining home rule, it's going to set a precedent. So I don't think it's a fair question, but it's saying why, if towns allow this, they're setting a precedent.
Well, it's really not up for the towns to allow. I mean, the legislature passed this law, and I'm not a lawyer, but there are different instances where home rule was allowed to be overruled, not necessarily related to renewable energy. So, it's kind of a gray area, but it's worth fighting on that level because it's something that, we can fight against.
I can jump in on that
Yeah.
for a second. So New York State is a home rule state. It's actually in our Constitution. So what the state's trying to do in this instance and overrule a local ordinance that the town put into place is unconstitutional. Period.
Next one for you, Bobbie. Answer, you might as well come back up. It says, you mentioned something about all-electric buildings. Does this also include commercial uses such as restaurants, mechanic shops, gas stations yet?
So I think I think that's still being negotiated or tweaked, and I think it's stepped also. I think that it's by a certain, if it's a residential property, they want it by a certain year. If it's a multi-family property, they want it by, they give you a little bit more time. So I think it becomes stepped, and I think there is, at first they were like everything, and then I think they're trying to maybe negotiate some things out. Like, for example, I think the farm equipment and stuff like that, I think is maybe going to be getting written out of that, but there's nothing set in stone yet. So the answer is I don't know, because it's still a moving part.